Okay, we welcome you to this 11th last session of our study of the book of Numbers. We're going to be looking tonight at Numbers 33 through 36. 33 through 36. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, our Redeemer, because you choose never to leave us or forsake us, we can, like Israel of old, rest secure in your protection. Encourage us to proceed with confidence as we do your blessed will. And teach us to depend on your grace rather than on our ability as we live your calling. That we may become worthy of your interest and magnify your holy name. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever.
Amen.
Well, here's a very quick overview of what we're going to look at tonight in these four concluding chapters of the book of Numbers. We're going to start with the travel encampment itinerary, which you most likely found terribly exciting reading, followed by a list of the tribal leaders that show up in the next chapter, along with the boundary lines of the land of Canaan. And only in chapter 35 did it probably become interesting for you as we turned our attention to some cities that the Levites were going to live in. And then closed out then with Zelophehad's daughters for a second time. So a quick review. Obviously the first two of these you've heard variations on it several times. Really the first 10 chapters, at least through verse 10 of chapter 10, is really setting up the book of Numbers. The Hebrew people have been at Mount Sinai for a year, and finally they have an opportunity to begin to move forward. And so there is a census, and every time there's a census, it is a new start. And so when that census takes place, that's when they know that they can begin to move. And in fact, they do. And all the way up, really from the time of the golden calf back in Exodus 32 up through chapter 10 of the book of Numbers, the Hebrew people have been just absolutely wonderful and obedient and kind in everything that they have done. And you think, wow, this is good. They really turned over a leaf following the golden calf. But it all hit the fan when you get to the next chapter. When you start then in chapter 11 all the way up through the death of them in chapter 25, it's just one downhill story after another. They don't do anything right, and finally, every single one of them has to die off before they can, in fact, make it possible for the second generation to make its way into Canaan. And that begins in chapter 26. We know that's the next beginning because there's another census that takes place in Numbers 26. So that's the new beginning for the second generation to now begin doing exactly what happened in the first 10 chapters, receiving various kinds of legislation, proposals from God as to what they're going to do when they finally make their way into Canaan. So all of the things they're going to have to face, God is beginning to share with them over those last several chapters of the book of Numbers. And that's where we pick up in the final 4 chapters of legislation, if you will, or commands for the people to do so that they can actually now get into Canaan. Most likely I'll end up with not enough time at the end, so I will go ahead and say it at this point. When we get to the end of the book of Numbers, all the I's have been dotted and all the T's have been crossed, except for one thing. One little piece of the story is left hanging. If you read through it, maybe you realize what it was. For several times in the story, beginning back in chapter 19 or 20, we've learned that Moses is going to die. And they've said it several times, you're going to die. But he hadn't died yet. So there's a loose thread at the end of Numbers, which actually we got to get all the way to the end of Deuteronomy before Moses will finally kick the bucket. So, hey, there you go. That's the next step. Deuteronomy. Maybe not. All right, let's jump in then into chapter 33. This is what they're going to have to do to be able to actually get into the land and begin to occupy it. But first, Moses is said to have written, at least tradition says he wrote the first 5 books of our Old Testament. But there isn't much within those first 5 books that actually says that he wrote them. But if you noticed in verse 2 of chapter 33, it says that Moses kept the list of all the encampment sites, places that they stopped along the way. And this encampment list site of sites actually goes all the way back to Egypt itself. Beginning about verse 3 or so and going up through verse 15, all of those encampments are the ones that we saw back in the book of Exodus. They first left Egypt on their way to Mount Sinai. The encampments that we have heard about and experienced along with them don't really begin until you get to verse 16. And they'll continue then down through 49 in this chapter. Now, it probably won't surprise you, especially if you read through that list and paid any attention to them at all, that many of those sites, I don't remember seeing that name before. And of course, even if we did see the name, by this point in this study, surely you've heard me say it enough times that we don't have a clue where it is anyway. If we don't even know where Mount Sinai is, there's probably a pretty good chance that we don't know where Hazeroth is, much less Haradach. And that's exactly the case. Even though they show up on various maps, we have no idea where these places were. And you know, that shouldn't surprise us because, well, I know that for many, many years, when I would read through this part of the Old Testament, I just assumed that, you know, the land was completely vacant. There wasn't anybody in the land, except for these 3 million Hebrews marching around. And you know, at some point in time, I realized you're just being stupid. It's not that the place was occupied. I mean, there are people living in this area where they were traveling much. There were nomadic persons there, but there were great trade routes. So there would have been traders making their way. There were people who did live there. And so as this 3 million person group of Hebrews is marching along and camping in various places, they are going to see traders come through them, or they're going to catch up with traders, or they're going to be camped in the backyard of Jim the Midianite. And he's going to wonder when the heck they're going to move on from where they are right this moment. And other persons coming and going, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's important to realize that because when you get down to verse 40, out of the blue, there is this comment that says, and the Canaanite king heard that the Hebrews were coming. Well, how would he have heard? I mean, they're not Canaan. But there are people passing through and among them and eventually getting up and saying, hey, did you know that just on your southern border, there are 3 million people? They're going to invade you at some point. And we don't know that this particular king was the one that did his stuff and routed the Hebrews way back when the 12 explorers went up and 10 of them said, we don't want to go in. And then they said, well, no, we changed our mind. We do want to go in. And Moses says, don't, because the Canaanites are going to kick your butt. And they do. So this may have been that Canaanite king. It may have been his son or grandson or great-grandson. Who knows? But the Canaanites have had some interactions with the Hebrews before. And so they're beginning to hear that here they are again. And you know, it's likely that sends a little bit of trepidation through them, having that many people on their border. So that's just a wonderful verse that you might not pay a lick of attention to unless you're thinking about it properly. Well, so you get down to verse 50, and God has 4 things that he tells the Hebrews you have got to do when you actually enter into Canaan. You don't do these 4 things, there's going to be problems. And if you don't do them, there will be 2 consequences. So the 4 things that God tells them that they must do, the first one takes place in verse 52. Actually, the first 2 do. You must drive out all the inhabitants. Now, good, mostly liberal 21st century people, that kind of gets under our skin just a little bit to drive out somebody. But, we live where we've driven out other people. You're not going to live anywhere in this world unless you've driven out somebody. Doesn't make it right, but let's just at least recognize that this happens all the time. And there are things that way back in the book of Genesis are talked about in regard to the inhabitants of Canaan. We don't have time to get into all of that, but here God tells them you've got to drive out the inhabitants if in fact you are going to settle in Canaan. And along the way, as you drive them out, you are going to come across all kinds of little stone and wooden statuary. That's their idols. Well, actually, it's their idols. It is their visual images of their gods. And given, of course, what you've already done with the Midianite women, there's a good chance that you're going to read a whole lot more into that than just little stone or wooden images. So you need to destroy all of those idols that you come across. And while you're at it, then also destroy the high places, the sanctuaries that you run across, because you're also going to be tempted to use those to worship. And if you do, you're going to end up worshiping other gods other than me, and I've already told you can't do that. So drive out the inhabitants and then destroy the idols and the holy sites. Then, third, actually take possession of the land. Don't just be there as occupants, transitory occupants who may then move on at some point in time. You need to actually occupy it and make it yours. That is, you need to build and rebuild the cities. You need to begin farming, take the arable land and start growing stuff, actually live in the land and at the same time that you settle it. And then fourth, we'll learn a little bit more about this in just a moment. You need to actually distribute the land, as he'd already talked about to Moses. You need to distribute the land by lot to each of the tribes that are going to be settling in the land of Canaan. Now, granted, 2.5 of the tribes are going to settle in Transjordan, but now for those 9.5 tribes inside of Canaan, you need to actually divide that up appropriately. And if you don't do that, the 2 problems show up then in 55 and 56. First, if you don't drive out the Canaanites, they are in time going to cause you trouble. He doesn't specify the troubles at this point, but if you know the rest of the story, you know that's precisely what happens. And God says, if you don't drive them out, then I will drive you out because of what you do, because of the influences that the Canaanites have upon you. And of course, later writers in the Old Testament are going to link both the Assyrian exile as well as the Babylonian exile to the fact that they did not originally drive out the Canaanites. And they became in some ways as evil as the Canaanites had been, in the sense of not worshiping the one and only true God. So, 4 things you've got to do, 2 things that will be consequences if you don't. And most likely, as you read this chapter, you went, wow, that was really exciting. I'm glad that God gave us this opportunity. And that's understandable, but part of the issue we have with readings like this is that our journey of faith is a completely spiritualized journey. It's not really grounded in ground in the same way that their journey was and still is. And because our faith journey tends to be, regardless of how we talk about it, it really in most ways ends up being a kind of individualistic journey. It's my faith journey, and I have these issues and I need these things fixed. Everything in this particular chapter pushes us to realize and recognize how corporate and how communal the faith journey really is. I can't live my faith apart from you. Sometimes I wish I could, and sometimes you may wish that would be, but we live it together. We're dependent upon each other at all times, and not just us as a community of faith in this congregation, but us and other Christians as well. We really do live this together. And in fact, there's a line, not in this chapter, but previously, back there at the end of 14 or early 15, and then also back in the book of Exodus, where God effectively gives Moses the option of having a new individual faith journey with God. Let's just forget these Hebrews. They're just nothing but trouble. Let's just start all over, you and me. And Moses is the one who says, no, we're not going to do that. It's not going to be an individual faith journey. It's all of us together. Well, that would solve a whole lot of problems in the church if we approach things that way. Might cause some other problems, but it would solve a bunch of them. All right, so chapter 34. We start off in this chapter with looking at the boundary lines of the land of Canaan. Here's the south border, here's the west border, here's the north border, and here's the east border. Did you pull out a map and spend time looking at it? I will not let you down. But you know, again, the problem is that we don't know any of these places. Well, we do know where some of them. We know where the Mediterranean Sea is. We know where the Dead Sea is, and the Sea of Galilee. But these other places, for the most part, we can guess kind of where they were, but that's about all we can really do. It may not be much different, really, with where your land is that you own right this moment, or on which you're paid right this moment. Have you ever dug up the little either concrete thing that's buried there, or the steel peg that lets you know where your borders are? Probably not, but you just kind of assume it's more or less there, and you let it go at that. And that's good enough as we're working our way through chapter 34 as well. Yeah, here you go. Thank you. I think that's mostly seeable. The description that's given here of Canaan, you don't know this from Scripture, but there are some early Egyptian verbal descriptions of the land of Canaan, more or less contemporary with this. And this description that we read in chapter 34 is surprisingly spot on with those Egyptian descriptions of Canaan. That's not to say that Moses or some other Hebrew didn't write it, but it is to say that there was an idea as to what Canaan was, and this fits that description. It's kind of an ideal set of boundaries. Because in fact, because the Hebrews don't follow what God says to do at the end of the previous chapter, they never do fully occupy this whole territory. The Philistines and the Phoenicians live alongside the Mediterranean Sea all the way up until 150 years before Christ. It's only then that the Jews finally do occupy all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea. So there's large portions of this area that they never do live in. And much of this down here never is a part of Israel. And most of this up here, they never occupy either. At the greatest extent of the Jewish United Kingdom under Solomon, they don't occupy that up there. Most of your maps dealing with the land of Canaan or Israel stop right about here. Tyre and Sidon, these two places, and they'll stop right about where Sidon is. Well, this is 75 miles on north of there. This is Beirut, Lebanon. This is Lebanon and Syria up in here. So they never do occupy most of this. But this is the ideal boundary, the land of Canaan. That's enough to say about that. That's much closer to what they actually do occupy. And here you can see the area, at least the southern area that I was referring to, the Philistines. This is where people like Goliath lived. 5 cities of the Philistines. And see here is Tyre and Sidon, and that other map was way on up above those 2 places. And I would draw your attention, not that you probably would care one way or the other, but right here is the tribe of Dan. Dan's got his own problems in Scripture. We won't go into that. But you may very well know that one of the descriptions of the land of Canaan is the land that is from Dan to Beersheba. Dan in the north to Beersheba. That covers Israel. But in that previous map, Dan's like right about here. Here's Dan. And Dan will end up being a city way up here. So some of the Danites at some point in time moved. Not the whole tribe, but they established a city way up in the north, up above the Sea of Galilee. And so when it talks about from Dan to Beersheba, they're referring to that city of Dan, not to the tribe of Dan. Don't you feel better now?
Yeah.
So there you see it, from Dan to Beersheba. So down in verse 16, verse 17, Eleazar, a priest, and Joshua, who will be the successor of Moses, are told that they need to be assisted by some God-appointed tribal leaders. So each of the tribes is going to have one person help out Eleazar and Joshua divide up the territory so that they receive appropriately by lot and by tribal size the land within the land of Canaan that they're supposed to receive. And each of those persons' names, who are for the most part never mentioned again in pages of Scripture, including even their fathers' names, they're never again mentioned. Here you have them for posterity purposes. And they do, in fact, appoint them, and they're the ones who, presumably, once we get into the book of Joshua, will be the ones who help them actually accomplish the divvying up of the land. That brings us to chapter 35. This is kind of, I find it kind of an intriguing chapter. There's 2 things of real importance. If you have noticed, if you've paid attention as we've worked our way through the book of Numbers, we always start out talking about the 12 tribes. And when we get done talking about the 12 tribes, then there's also the Levites. So then we spend time talking about the Levites and priests. The census, was of the 12 tribes. You get the 3,550. And then you deal with the Levites, 22,000 Levites that they locate. Slightly different numbers when we get to the second census. So once again, we've been dealing with the 12 tribes, giving their land, divvying it up appropriately as it should be done when we get into Canaan, Oh yeah, now we've got to deal with the Levites because they're not a part of any of that we've been talking about. So that's what the purpose of chapter 35 is all about. The tribes have what are essentially going to amount to large tracts of land on which they're going to be able to live, assuming that they drive out the Canaanites. And while this is not a fully appropriate illustration, if you're thinking about the United States, this tribe's going to get Arkansas and that tribe's going to get Missouri to be able to live in kind of situation. Within each of those tribal areas, each tribe is then more or less supposed to give 4 cities to the Levites, so that among the 12 tribes there will then be 48 cities that the Levites will be able to live in, because they don't inherit land like the other 12 tribes do, but they've got to live somewhere. So there will be these cities given to the Levites, and, oh yeah, by the way, also the priests, where they will live for time in perpetuity. By saying that they give each about 4 cities apiece, that doesn't mean that there are no non-Levites living in those towns. There are regular old folks living there too, but it also is a town where the Levites live. So, if it was in this general area, well, you've got Bentonville and Rogers and Lowell and Springdale and Fayetteville. Well, they designate Springdale as the place where the Levites are going to live. Doesn't mean there aren't other Springdalites, but they get the Levites also. Of the 48 towns, there will be 13 of them, is that the right number? In which the priests will live. It's either 5 or 13. I have to take a quick look again. In which they will be living. The rest will then be Levite. The priests will live in this much smaller number of cities. The Levite cities, now these are really more towns than cities. These are not metropolises. They're very small areas. The Levites can't inherit land, but they still have to be able to have a little land to grow some food. Most of their food's going to come from the people giving tithes and offerings. But they need a little bit of arable land for crop production themselves, but mostly they need pasturage to be able, for their cows and their goats and their sheep to be able to eat some grass and grow appropriately. So in each one of these, so in Springdale, on the outskirts of Springdale, you'll count off 1,000 cubits in each direction on the outskirts of town, so that the outskirts of town will not be where the suburbs can eventually get put. This is where they're going to have pasturage for their animals. So a cubit is this distance right here, from the bottom of your elbow up to your hand. So about 18 inches. So 1,000 cubits is 1,500 feet, or about a quarter mile. So a quarter mile out from the city of Springdale will be where they can grow where their cows and goats and sheep can eat. And to make all of that plain as day, then the very next verse tells you, so that means there's, that's 2,000 cubits on each side. You got that? So first of all, let me start with the Levite cities. Not that you can see them, but where all these names are, that's going to be Levite cities across Israel. So you can see they're pretty well divided up throughout all the territory. So a Levite city looks kind of like this, which is pretty cool if all the Levites dance on the head of a pin. But of course the Levites don't. So that description in verses 4 and 5 is really hard to make sense of. But the old rabbinical stuff explained it this way, that as a town would grow, as Springdale expands in size, whatever the outer limits of the Springdale city limits are, it is from that point that you then add on the 1,000 cubits. So it doesn't matter how big the city gets, it's always another 1,000 cubits in every direction for the pasturage for their animals. Okay? Which really makes sense, because the larger the town grows, you need more pasturage. 20 Levites need more pasture than 2. So then there's all this additional space that gets added in. So what starts off, if they were all dancing on the head of a pin, as about 200 acres, could get to who knows how big. But you still have that particular space out there to be able to feed your cows and so on. Make sense? And that 1,000 cubits and or 2,000 cubits, many, many, many years later, that's what gives rise to the teaching that that's how far you can walk on the Sabbath and not break the Sabbath. You can walk 1,000 cubits because you have to. You got to get out there and, milk your cow or whatever. So you got to get to it. And it's not going to be beyond that point. We assume they've got a fence or something at the end of the 1,000 cubits. So that's where that comes from. But of course, enterprising Jews simply know that they're told they can't go farther than 1,000 cubits from home. So before it gets to dusk on Friday night, you go out there and you dig up a bucket full of home turf so that you can walk your 1,000 cubits and then toss a little bit of home out, and then you got 1,000 cubits you can go deep, because it's 1,000 cubits from home. We wouldn't do that.
No.
Is that good enough? Okay. Beginning in verse 9 all the way to verse 34, they talk about cities of refuge. And if you want to read a little more about the cities of refuge, you can turn to Deuteronomy 19. Kind of read the exact same thing again, but it'll be another book and you'll feel like, oh, that's insightful. It tells me what I need to know. Of the 48 cities, 13 of which are for the priests to be able to live in, there are also 6 of those that will be designated as cities of refuge. These are, if you will, if we're playing a game of tag, these are base. Safe places. These are sanctuaries in that sense of the term. Why do you need sanctuaries? Well, that's what the rest of the chapter is all about, to make sense of why this is important. Well, so all the way through the book of Numbers, once we get past chapter 10, the first generation are made out to be just rotten to the core. The second generation is all wonderful, all full of niceness. But God's smart enough to know that once we get into the land, if not the second generation, then maybe the third or the fourth, there's going to be a few Restalians among the Hebrews. And so this covers what we do with them. So, what happens if that Terry Person Dixon decides that he's just absolutely had it with Jim? And he takes a hammer to Jim. Or Vanita has to plant it. and because Dixon has killed him off. Or maybe he doesn't use a hammer, maybe he uses a baseball bat, something made out of wood, and takes it to Jim, forcing Venita to have to plant it. Or maybe he takes his fist and does the same thing, because, that's just how Dixon is. And so, that's homicide. That is murder with intent to kill. Not only did he use iron or wood or fist, he also had a history with Jim, as all of us know and could point to, and he has intent. If he hadn't had intent, he wouldn't have had the baseball bat with him when he went over to see Jim. So, put all that together, that's homicide, murder. But it may be that really Dixon and Jim are big buds. And gosh, he still kills off Jim. This is kind of a theme here, but he didn't mean to. He just took Jim down to Lake Alma to take him on a hike because he enjoyed it the first time and he wanted his buddy Jim to see it, and he was so excited about having Jim there that when he's up on the top of one of those cliffs walking around Lake Alma, he's not paying attention and he's getting kind of full of himself, and he's reverting back to how he was as a kid, and he starts telling Jim about his days as a hockey player and how he could still check people with his hips, and so he does just that. He checks against Jim, and Jim's not paying a lick of attention. Jim's just kind of there, and he gets checked, and he goes bouncing off the cliff, dead just the same way the baseball bat would have been. But he didn't mean to do that. Or Dixon shows up to help me cut some wood on my property. And Jim comes along to kind of help out as well, and they've been doing that all day long. And finally, Dixon has decided that he's tired of cutting wood already laying on the ground. He wants to actually cut a tree down. And by this point in time, Jim's kind of paying no attention. He's looking at butterflies and listening to owls hooting. And Dixon does cut the tree down, and it lands right on top of poor old Jim looking at butterflies. If you drop something on a person inadvertently, it is not homicide. It was unpremeditated. So it's only manslaughter. Poor old Jim's still dead, but Dixon didn't mean to. So we've got a distinction built in here between homicide and manslaughter. If it is homicide, if Dixon meant to do it, that's covered down in verses 16 through 21. That's where the iron object and the stone and the wood and so on shows up. Yeah, Dixon, take note. If it is homicide, well, then Venita will call out to her blood avenger to take care of Dixon for her. And he will go and find Dixon and kill him, because blood has to answer to blood. We think that's a terrible thing. However, it keeps the escalation from happening. Venita and her crew can't go find Dixon and kill Dixon and Dixon's wife and Dixon's dog and whatever they can find along the way. They can only deal with Dixon. And that puts an end to it right there. Interestingly, the word that is used here for blood avenger is goel, which is the very same word that most of the way through the Old Testament is translated as kinsman redeemer. You go, good for that. Who cares? But kinsman redeemer is the term that is used for Boaz, who takes care of Naomi and Ruth when they show back up lost spouse, sons. The kinsman redeemer is the one who, this may, we're glad this doesn't happen today, but if a guy dies without having an heir, then the kinsman redeemer comes along and has sex with his wife to be able to produce an heir. It will not then be the child of the guy who comes, the kinsman redeemer. It is to be treated legally as the child of his dead brother or dead king, so that the line is able to continue, to be able to continue to inherit the land. So it's a terribly important person who rights a wrong. Well, that's why that same word is used here. Whoever Venita has for that kinsman redeemer rights the wrong that Dixon has done. And so he goes out and finds Dixon and kills him so that it takes care of him killing Jim on the front end. That's if it's a homicide. But if it's manslaughter, kinsman redeemer may still go after Dixon because he doesn't know necessarily on the front end, which it is. But Dixon does, and Dixon hightails it for the closest city of refuge. Because if he can get to base, he'll be safe. Kinsman redeemer can't touch him in the city of refuge. And as long as he stays in the city of refuge, he'll be fine. If he ever sets foot outside the city, kinsman redeemer can do him in. But as long as he stays in the city of refuge, he's safe. Well, so does he ever get to leave? I mean, he had to leave his family to be able to hang out? Well, yes, he can. Should the day arrive that the priest dies, he'll get to go home after the priest dies. The priest effectively functions as a kind of atonement for Dixon. His death, even though it's not a blood thing, his death atones for Dixon and whoever else may be in the city of refuge, so that at that point in time, he gets to go home. Now, if Dixon's lucky, Lowell will die 6 days after he gets there. But, Dixon, Lowell just won't die. And so it could be 30 years before he gets to finally leave and go home. However long it is, the chance that it might be is considered okay, because the original death happened by chance too. He hockey checked him up on the top of the cliff at Lake Allen. So chance covers the chance. And those of us reading that might, thinking in New Testament terms, go, now that begins to make sense about our great high priest dying and the liberation that he provides us. So it all kind of fits together here. There's more.
But wait.
So maybe it really was murder. And Dixon says, I'm still going to go to the city of refuge. Because if I can get there, I might be able to pull the wool over their eyes. But folks that live in that city of refuge, they've been through this a time or two already, and they know what they're supposed to do. And so when he gets there and claims that he's unfairly being chased by a kinsman redeemer, they say, well, what'd you do? And they listen to it. And if the kinsman redeemer shows up and gives his side of the story, then they effectively have a trial. And if it turns out that Dixon really did commit unpremeditated murder, he can stay there until the priest dies. He's okay. But if they have the trial and they determine that not only is he a murderer, he's a dadgum liar on top of it, and he did really commit a murder, well, then they say, you can't stay here. They escort him outside the city limits where the kinsman redeemer is waiting for him to finish the business. But the trial has to have two witnesses who watched Dixon do what he did. Bob and Betty have both got to say, yes, he committed murder. If it's only Bob, that's not good enough. You have Bob and Betty say that against Dixon. And if they do, escort him out of the city of refuge, and he's taken care of. Does it all make sense? It actually is a pretty good way of going at it. Now, I'm not for capital punishment in any way, shape, or form, but in a context in which we do not have a modern state, we don't have judicial court systems, and we don't have policemen and all the other stuff that we just take for granted and let them do the dirty work so we don't have to think about it much. That works pretty well. It allows not for vengeance to occur, but for justice to happen. And that's ultimately what we want. I mean, we want a lot of mercy too, but insofar as there's got to be justice for things, so that everybody can continue to live together as a community, justice is just, we talk about justice all the time. Well, this is how justice was guaranteed, if you will, at this particular moment in time. Lots that could be said there, but hopefully that at least makes sense. You can't really tell where the cities of refuge are there, but on this map coming up, even though it's fuzzy, you can at least see where they are. 3 in the Transjordan, 3 over in Canaan itself. So, it'd be sort of the same as having a city of refuge in Bella Vista and one in Little Rock and one down in Texarkana. So that depending on where you're at, you'd have a half of a chance to be able to get there in time. Oops. And that brings us back, to Zelophehad's daughters one more time, chapter 36. Remember back in chapter 27, these daughters approached Moses and the priest saying, our dad died, but he didn't do anything terrible. He just was a sinner. He didn't join Korah or Dathan or Abiram. He just died. And, we don't have any brothers, so his land's going to go, and his name's going to be forgotten. We don't think that's right. So they talk to Moses, and he goes, make a good point. Let me talk to God about it. God says, they do make a good point. So you now need to modify what we said earlier, and the land will pass down through the daughters if there's no sons. If there's no daughters either, well, then it will pass to brothers, cousins, uncles, but it'll stay within that tribe. That's all fine and good. But it's been a little while since that decision was made. And so the Gileadite cousins of these 5 sisters have had some time to think about it. And they've decided there's a problem with that ruling. Because these 5 daughters of Zelophehad are kind of like Betty Jo and Billy Joe and Bobby Joe, if you remember them from the Petticoat Junction. And most likely when they marry, they're going to marry some guy from outside the tribe. And when they marry outside the tribe, since the land, except in this little unique circumstance, the land passes them down through sons, there's going to be land that should belong to Manasseh's tribe through Gilead. It's going to be lost because it's going to become a part of one of these other tribes. And not even The year of Jubilee is going to fix that. So we think there's an issue. Not as big of an issue as that, but there's, we think there's an issue here. So they broach the topic, mention it to God, to Moses, who says, yeah, I've talked with God, and you're exactly right. So the three Armstrong daughters have got to marry their cousins. They can't marry somebody else. So that way the land will at least stay within the Gileadite clan. Then everything will be fine. You've got to marry only these people. And Zelophehad's daughters, having heard that particular ruling, say, hey, that's fine with us. We're okay with that. And they do marry some of their cousins, and everybody lives happily ever after. From that point on. Yeah.
We do that.
Might not have all their teeth. Yeah. I wasn't going to go there.
Go to the family reunion from a girlfriend.
That's just so tempting to respond to.
Don't.
So here's some of the things that we can reflect on these last few chapters in Numbers. First is an itinerary of faith. Most likely, every single one of us in this room has had a resume that we've given to somebody that tells the other person, the employer, or the human relations guru, what we've done and who we are. And those of us who are academicians, we don't have resumes, we have visas. We distribute to people, but it accomplishes the same things, except it's even crazier, because then we talk about all the things we wrote and so on as well. Those are all fine and good, and they're wonderful snapshots of an identity of a person. I well remember when I had to have my psycho whatever test before becoming clergy. They asked me the question, so tell us about yourself. Well, I've been in school for 32 years at that point in time in my life. I've never done anything except been in school. So I described my life in terms of school. And I get all done, and I feel pretty good about what I've said. And the psycho babbler across the table from me says, did you not do anything else in your life except go to school? And my response was, no. He wanted me to talk about all kinds of other stuff, and I just kind of put him into the conversation because there wasn't anything more for me to talk about except it was school. Have you ever written an itinerary of your faith journey? It's one of those kind of neat but troubling things to deal with that might expose yourself in ways that you don't really want anybody else to see, but maybe you need to share with somebody else to show how unfaithful you've been. On the other hand, it may be one of those things where, just like that encampment list, suddenly you begin to realize where you have come from, how wonderful it is where you are right this moment in time. And leave you then with a lot of rejoicing and gratitude that you can offer a God who has stayed with you through all the ridiculousness that you've done across a lifetime. If you haven't done it, you should. And yes, the Hebrews did it. Turn to Psalm 106 and read through, not right this moment necessarily, unless you're tired of listening to me, but read Psalm 106 and you will see the Hebrews reflecting on their life as God's people, good and bad. It's a really intriguing psalm in that way. Even boundaries in chapter 34 gives us an opportunity to be reflective. Even though, as I showed you on that map, those were kind of ideal boundaries, but they never did really inhabit fully. there are a lot of people who say, well, yeah, I suppose I kind of like God, but I really like my freedom. And, somewhere around the end of my life, I'll get around to dealing with God. And that kind of works okay if you don't die in time. But Constantine pulled that off, for instance. He didn't get baptized until effectively his deathbed, so that way he can do whatever the king wants to do until then. And, if you want to take the chance, fine, but going ahead and becoming a part of God's kingdom early in life does not restrict the possibilities of life for us. It really expands the possibilities of life for us. There are those who would question that, to argue with it. But anybody from the inside reflecting on life knows that to be true. That the life I've had with God is so much more than I could have had apart from God. And I think that's one of the neat things that this chapter begins to reveal to us, that really God offers so much more to us than we're ever able to really fully live into. But if we could, life would be so good. And then finally, the last two chapters give us an opportunity to reflect once again on how important and real grace is, as well as be able to recognize that grace is not the same thing as permission. It's very different than just unqualified permission to do as you please. There really is a history to salvation that starts with God and ends with God. Here's how I would make this connection in these particular chapters. There are laws of God that are established prior to chapters 35 and 36. But at some point in time, in the midst of the faith journey of the Hebrews with God, they reflect on those original laws and say, well, that does a really good job of handling most of the issues we face in life, but there's this issue that seems to have sort of cropped up. It doesn't seem to do a good job of addressing that. And so they would go back to God and say, but. And God would then respond to it. Sometimes God will say, you're blowing smoke, stick with the law. Other times, like in chapter 35 and 36, the result of the interaction with God is a modified law. And that's what lies behind my comment up here. Those laws may be written in stone, but they're not set in stone. There are just too many things across human history where, if you will, the Jewish faith or the Christian faith has modified laws that we find in Scripture or at earlier moments in time in Christian theology, Christian history. Sometimes they made mistakes, and change gets changed back at some point in time. We had lots of time to talk about fun things that only theologians bicker around with. We could talk about Athanasius and Arius, for instance, and how they go back and forth on stuff over a period of time. And there may be some of those that we're facing now that will change again somewhere down the line. But there's others where I think it's okay to realize that God's law is kind of malleable. And it does change over time. Sometimes it's a social position, sometimes it's even a theological position, where we can begin to think differently about the way we live. And that's okay. It's right there in the midst of Scripture. We read two examples tonight about cities and Zelophehad's daughters who dealt with it twice. Well, Patty said, so what do you think everybody's going to do when you get to the end of the book of Numbers? And I smiled and said, well, they're going to say, oh, I kind kind of get it now. Let's go back and do it again now that I understand. She just turned her back on me and walked away. So probably not. We'll do something different. So the next class is going to be one that will be joint taught, which has nothing to do with special issue number 4, or whatever it was. We're going to be dealing with deadly sins and Christian virtues. Since I broached the topic originally, I get to choose the one I want to deal with, so I'm going to deal with the deadly sins part. And James back there is going to deal with the Christian virtues part.
He's going to correct me where I get off a little bit.
I'm going to create the problems and he's going to fix it.
Did we do this in Animal House?
I've never seen Animal House.
You're a better man for it.
Yeah. So this is a class, there are 7 deadly sins. There are 7 Christian virtues. Our spring studies have usually been about 5 weeks long, and it really makes it tough to get through these studies that are really long. I mean, how do you do 13 minor prophets in 5 weeks? So James and I are going to we're going to have an introductory week, and then 1 week for each of the deadly sins. So it's going to be an 8-week study. So it'll start February 1 and run through March 29. It will not be the Wednesday of Ash Wednesday. It will then stop 1 week prior to Holy Week. So effectively all of February and March. Deadly sins and Christian virtues. Mine looks much more interesting. Or if that doesn't float your boat, maybe this one.
Oh, goodness.
Thanks for being a part of the number study, and
Oh, thank
we'll
you.
see
Thank
each
you.
other in addition.